Ted had always hated Mondays, but this one took the cake, or whatever the slimy, six-limbed equivalent of cake was on his client's home planet. The holographic file projected an image of Kalesh the Crusher, CEO of a conglomerate that made interstellar real estate deals look as friendly as black hole mergers. "Your newest assignment," Sandra, his boss, had drawled earlier that morning. "Think of it as expanding our clientele. It'll look great on your resume." Sandra clearly saw dollar signs, not the intergalactic train wreck this case probably was. Kalesh the Crusher was a towering reptilian monstrosity, scales gleaming like toxic oil slicks. His grin could only be described as predatory. Ted, slouched in a chair far too small for the creature, suppressed a shudder. "So, human," Kalesh boomed, his voice vibrating the flimsy walls. "They say you're the best legal mind on this pathetic mudball. Let's see if you live up to the hype." Ted's hand shot to his briefcase, pulling out a depressingly thick contract. The standard stuff: acquisition agreements, resource valuations, clauses thicker than his law school textbooks. It had the whiff of a boring, if massively lucrative, deal. But then he stumbled into Section 12, Subparagraph 6, and all thoughts of bonuses and promotions evaporated. "Wait, hold on!" Ted squinted, rereading the clause that made his stomach drop. The planet Kalesh wanted was listed as uninhabited. Problem was, Ted knew that term. It was legal code for not advanced enough to defend themselves. A horrifying picture formed in his mind: mining rigs tearing through lush landscapes, cities reduced to ash, all to fuel some twisted galactic tycoon's ego trip. His gut twisted. This wasn't some dry corporate law. This was a death sentence for an entire world. Ted was used to compartmentalizing. It was how he'd survived the cutthroat world of corporate law, how he'd justified morally grey cases to himself. But this was different. He glanced up at Kalesh, whose smooth grin hadn't faltered. The alien was radiating impatience, a predator ready to pounce. "There seems to be a discrepancy," Ted finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Had he just signed his own death warrant? Kalesh's tail twitched, the only outward sign of his annoyance. "Discrepancy. My survey teams assure me the planet is a barren wasteland. Perfect for redevelopment." That's where the loophole was. Kalesh hadn't technically lied, just conveniently omitted the whole sentient civilization part. Ted's pulse quickened. Maybe, just maybe, he had a way out of this. "Let's revisit those survey reports," Ted said with a confidence he didn't feel. "Just to be thorough. Wouldn't want anything unexpected to crop up once the deal's final." Kalesh eyed him with narrowed eyes, his reptilian brain calculating. Ted held his gaze, refusing to flinch. After an agonizingly long moment, Kalesh nodded. "Very well, human. If it will put your primitive mind at ease." The survey reports arrived a few days later, buried in gigabytes of data. Ted lost himself in grainy scans, spectral readings, and ecological assessments. Nights blurred into days fueled by caffeine and a growing sense of discontent. Then it was there, buried amidst geological charts, a flicker of anomalous energy readings. With trembling hands, Ted cross-referenced them against known biosignatures. There it was, proof of life. Not just microbial, but complex. Cities, however rudimentary, hinted at a society, a culture, and Kalesh wanted to grind it all into dust. The revelation hit Ted like a meteor strike. It wasn't just about legal arguments now. This was personal, a battle between his nagging sense of right and wrong and a chillingly amoral opponent. He knew playing for time was useless. He needed to turn those biosignatures into something Kalesh couldn't brush aside. A loophole, a technicality, anything to stop the contract. Frantic, he dug into the deepest recesses of galactic law. Trade treaties, resource exploitation agreements, obscure precedents set centuries ago. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. Sandra popped her head in, but Ted barely grunted as he scrolled and clicked with laser focus. Then it hit him. A precedent case from the early days of interstellar expansion. A loophole so obscure, so outdated, even most lawyers had forgotten about it. But it applied. A planet, no matter how primitive the inhabitants, had the right to a hearing before any major change of ownership. It was a long shot, designed to protect newly discovered civilizations, but it was something. Grinning with a manic edge, Ted drafted the motion. He'd force Kalesh into a new arena, not one of financial might, but of law. He might be outgunned, outsmarted, but he'd be damned if he wouldn't go down swinging. The day he filed the motion, Sandra cornered him, fear and fury mixing in her eyes. "What have you done, Ted? Kalesh is displeased. This jeopardizes everything." For the first time in weeks, Ted felt a surge of defiance instead of dread. "Everything, or just our obscene bonuses?" Sandra blanched, then stormed off, heels clicking like a death knell. Good, let them all worry, and worry they would. Because Ted, the washed-up human lawyer with a bleeding heart, was about to drag a galactic tycoon to court. News of Ted's legal bombshell spread like a plasma storm. He was mocked, threatened, and dismissed by the high-powered lawyers on Kalesh's payroll. Sandra treated him like a pariah, muttering about damaged reputations and career suicide. Ted just shrugged. His reputation was the last thing on his mind. When the trial date arrived, Ted walked into the Galactic Commerce Tribunal not with a team of sleek legal sharks, but with a battered briefcase and a gut full of determination. The courtroom was packed, media drones hovered, analysts spat out cynical predictions, and somewhere billions of eyes were watching this showdown. Kalesh the Crusher glared at him from behind a table loaded with legal talent. The alien looked more enraged than worried, clearly confident his high-priced lawyers could steamroll this human irritant. Ted presented his evidence. Survey readings, obscure legal precedents, and a holographic projection of the planet, teeming with life. When he invoked the ancient law of first contact and the planet's undeniable right to a hearing, the courtroom erupted. Kalesh's lawyers went on the offensive, attacking the technicality, Ted's credentials, even the legitimacy of the law itself. They painted a picture of progress, halted by legal red tape, of lost profits, and a primitive world needlessly holding back galactic advancement. Ted countered, his voice shaking slightly as he argued about the sanctity of life, the dangers of unchecked exploitation. Legal jargon twisted with ethical pleas in a desperate gamble. Then, the real bombshell. A representative from the planet itself, a shivering delegation hastily transported across light years, stood before the tribunal. Their fear was clear, but so was their desperate hope. Ted had sent word, a risky move, but he couldn't stand by and watch them get destroyed blindly. The image of these simple beings, facing down a corporate giant, resonated even through the cynical legal haze. The court fell silent. Kalesh's grin was gone, replaced with a snarl. The final verdict would take weeks, maybe months, but the tide had turned. Ted, the underdog who dared to speak up, had started an intergalactic firestorm. In the days that followed, the case exploded beyond the confines of the courtroom. Ted's face was plastered across news feeds, analyzed and endlessly debated. He found strange allies, grizzled activists cheering his fight, wide-eyed idealists suddenly invested in arcane galactic lore, even rival corporations sensing an opportunity to take down Kalesh. The relentless pressure pushed the tribunal to accelerate its ruling. When the judgment finally came, Ted sat huddled in his dingy apartment, too wired to sleep. The screen blared to life, showing the stoic tribunal head, and then the words, "The tribunal rules in favor of the plaintiff. Ownership of the planet in question cannot be transferred without the express consent of its inhabitants." Victory. A shaky, unbelievable victory. Ted had done it. He'd saved a planet he'd never even seen. Yet there was no jubilation, only a bone-deep exhaustion and a nagging concern. This wasn't over. Kalesh was not known for taking defeat gracefully. His fears were proven right within hours. News reports blared of corporate sabotage, mysterious accidents on the newly protected planet, Kalesh's henchmen trying to stir unrest and destabilize their fragile society. Sandra called, her voice laced with acid. "This is your fault, Ted. You've made an enemy you can't possibly beat." Maybe she was right. The fight had just shifted arenas. Kalesh might not be able to buy the planet, but he could still destroy it out of spite. Yet Ted felt a strange calm. He had looked into the abyss, faced what he was capable of, and come out changed. This wasn't just about a contract anymore. This was his line in the sand. He picked up his battered briefcase. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was a defender. And this world, this vulnerable civilization light years away, they were his clients now. Kalesh thought he was fighting a human lawyer. He had no idea what he was really up against. Ted launched himself into a different kind of legal battle. There were petitions to draft, pleas for galactic aid, and a whirlwind of public appearances to rally support for the planet. The media attention was a double-edged sword. It brought awareness, but also painted a glaring target on his back. One evening, as he left a televised debate, the shadows in an alley seemed to shift. His instincts, honed from years of navigating corporate backstabbing, screamed. He whirled around just as a figure lunged from the darkness, a glint of metal in its hands. Time slowed. A messy street brawl was far removed from the polished lies of corporate boardrooms. But Ted was surprisingly quick, adrenaline and old self-defense instincts kicking in. He dodged the first strike, countered with a clumsy blow that at least knocked the attacker back. Then, a blur of motion. Someone else materialized from the darkness. A scaled reptilian hand gripped the attacker's shoulder, yanking them back. Ted blinked, staring at what could only be one of Kalesh's goons. But instead of finishing the job, the creature grunted something unintelligible and shoved the would-be assassin stumbling back into the shadows. Before Ted could process it, the hulking alien melted back into the alleyway, leaving only the echo of retreating footsteps and Ted's pounding heart. Had he just been saved by Kalesh's own enforcer? The incident left him shaken and more confused than ever. Was this a warning from Kalesh? A bizarre show of force, meant to intimidate? Questions buzzed in his head, but there were no easy answers. The lines of this fight were getting terrifyingly blurred. Days later, Sandra called. Her voice was strained, less hostile than usual. "Ted, I have an offer. From Kalesh." His stomach lurched. He should hang up, but morbid curiosity won out. "He's willing to negotiate," Sandra said. "A development partnership, limited resource extraction, and a trust fund for the planet. In exchange, you drop all legal action." It was a surprisingly generous concession, yet it reeked of a poisoned apple. Kalesh the Crusher rarely compromised, especially not out of the goodness of his non-existent heart. Ted couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point. On one hand, there was the very real chance to ensure the planet's survival, even prosperity. On the other, it felt like a betrayal of the principles he'd fought so hard for, and of the trust those distant beings had unknowingly placed in him. The image of the alien representative, standing so bravely before the tribunal, flashed through his mind. Could he settle for anything less than true justice? "I need to think about it," Ted said finally, ending the call. He stared at the flickering cityscape outside his window, wrestling with the choices before him. The next morning, he found himself stepping not into his office, but onto a public transport shuttle heading toward the spaceport. He had sent messages, arranged clandestine meetings, all without telling a soul. Hours later, a rickety ship deposited him on a dusty landing pad in the middle of nowhere. There, awaiting him, was a delegation from the planet he had saved. They weren't lawyers or dignitaries, but simple farmers, artisans. Their faces weathered but alight with a quiet gratitude. They took him to their village, a cluster of modest dwellings nestled among fields glowing with strange bioluminescence. They spoke in hesitant phrases via a hastily programmed translator, and yet understanding transcended words. They showed him their art, their music, the intricate way their community thrived in harmony with their world. And in those simple acts of life, Ted found his answer. This wasn't about legal precedents or corporate loopholes. It was about preserving something precious, irreplaceable. When the comms unit in his pocket chirped with Sandra's furious demands, he silenced it without a second thought. Later, as he stood under the alien starscape, Ted drafted his response to Kalesh. It wasn't a compromise, but a declaration. The planet was not for sale, not for exploitation. If Kalesh wanted a fight, he'd get one. Fought not just in courts, but in the hearts and minds of this newly awakened world. Hitting send felt like stepping off a cliff. What followed would be war, messy, brutal, and utterly unknown. But Ted, the human lawyer who had found his purpose light years from home, was ready. Kalesh's response came, not as a legal motion, but as a wave of terror. News feeds erupted with reports of sabotage, failing power grids, poisoned water supplies, orchestrated riots on the once peaceful world. It was clear Kalesh wouldn't be bound by law nor morality. This was a fight for survival. Ted became a wartime strategist. Networks hummed with messages as he rallied supporters. Lawyers turned activists, former corporate rivals sniffing a chance to bring down Kalesh, even disgruntled members of the giant's own corporation feeding him information. He advised the planet's simple inhabitants, working with them to fortify, to strategize, and most importantly, to document. Every outrage, every act of violence was meticulously recorded. The evidence beamed across the galaxy. This wasn't just a backwater planet anymore, but a symbol of Kalesh the Crusher's unhinged brutality. The tide, surprisingly, began to turn. Protests sparked in unexpected sectors. Kalesh's other business deals stalled as partners grew uneasy with his increasingly unhinged methods. Even within the Galactic Commerce Tribunal, voices of dissent arose, questioning their own complicity within a system geared towards profit above all else. Yet, for every bit of momentum Ted gained, Kalesh retaliated twice as hard. When bribed officials on the planet mysteriously collapsed, when transport ships carrying vital supplies went missing, the chilling pattern was impossible to ignore. Ted barely slept, haunted by the certainty that his actions, however well-intentioned, were causing pain and suffering. One night, a cryptic message appeared in his inbox, a request for a meeting in a neutral space station, and a name that made his blood run cold: Kalesh. The station was a shadowy den of backroom deals and whispered threats. Yet, Ted strode towards the private booth, fueled by a mix of desperation and defiance. There, the monstrous form of Kalesh awaited. "You've caused me great inconvenience, human," the alien hissed, but under the rage a flicker of something like respect glinted. "And you've shown your true colors," Ted retorted, settling into the seat across. What followed wasn't a negotiation, but a brutal exchange of truths. Kalesh spoke of cutthroat realities, of galactic economics, of how sentiment was a fatal weakness. Ted countered with concepts the alien likely found laughable: the right to self-determination, the enduring strength of unity, the echoes of civilizations destroyed by unchecked greed. As the tense hours stretched, one thing became clear: neither would sway the other. Finally, Kalesh rose, an unspoken agreement reached. This stalemate wouldn't be broken at a negotiation table. It would be decided on battlefields, both legal and tragically literal. The conflict reached a fever pitch. Each day brought news of fresh clashes on the planet, of Ted's hastily assembled defense force repelling brutal attacks. The galactic court hummed with a constant churn of legal motions and counter-maneuvers. But both sides knew this was no longer simply a matter of winning or losing. It was a fight for the soul of the entire galactic order. Kalesh grew more desperate, more ruthless. Assassination attempts on Ted became a grim routine. Offers of unimaginable wealth rolled in, immediately countered by threats chilling enough to curdle his blood. Once, he even found Sandra in his apartment, not with hostility, but a haunted look. "If you lose, Ted," she whispered, "and they come for me, just promise to use that idealism of yours to defend me in court." It was strangely touching, evidence of the unsettling ripple effect his actions had started. The final showdown played out on 100 news feeds. Kalesh's private army descended on the planet, the alien himself broadcasting a chilling ultimatum: surrender or face annihilation. Cities burned, fields turned into battlegrounds. But the brave, simple people, armed with little more than a world to defend, fought back with astounding ferocity. In the courtroom, Ted pulled out his last desperate move. Citing age-old precedents and obscure passages of intergalactic law, he made an audacious case not just for the planet, but for changing the very definition of ownership. It was, even he knew, a long shot, a gamble that could backfire spectacularly. Yet, something had shifted with the tide of the war. The tribunal, usually coldly pragmatic, now watched images of defiance, of sacrifice. As Ted spoke, it wasn't just about legal jargon anymore, but about the fundamental rights that made a civilization worth the name. Days turned into agonizing weeks. Then, with a shock that sent gasps across the galaxy, the verdict came down. Ted won. The planet was declared a sovereign entity, its people given full rights under galactic law. But the greater victory lay elsewhere. The tribunal, in its ruling, enshrined the principles of self-determination and respect for life, creating a precedent that would resonate for generations. Years later, Ted found himself on a balcony overlooking a bustling city. But these weren't the towering, neon-drenched structures of his homeworld. This cityscape was organic. Structures seamlessly blending with vibrant flora, the air humming with the chirp of strange, beautiful creatures. He was far from the starched suits of courtrooms, the clamour of media speculation. The planet wasn't a news story anymore, but a thriving world. "You saved us," a soft voice came from a vid-screen recording Ted held in his hands. One of the original delegates, flanked by a large group of the planet's inhabitants, stared into the camera as she continued speaking. "But more than that, you taught us to fight for ourselves." Ted smiled, a weary but genuine one, as he closed the message he had played more than 1,000 times over the years. He wasn't some grand savior. If anything, the planet had saved him. He was still a lawyer, albeit with an unorthodox practice, travelling the stars to advise budding civilizations to fight the battles Kalishes still waged. Sandra was even his partner, her ruthlessness tempered with a newfound, if begrudging, sense of justice. Scars of the past were still visible, both on the planet's landscape and on Ted's own psyche. Nights haunted by what-ifs lingered, as did the ghosts of those lost in the struggle. But there was growth, a hard-earned peace, and the knowledge that a battle won wouldn't guarantee a war's end. And Ted? He wasn't the same man who'd taken that case all those years ago. He was tougher, wiser, and still fueled by an idealism that had not only saved a planet, but also redeemed his own soul. For him, the courtroom would always be a battlefield, his greatest weapon not legal loopholes, but an unwavering belief in something bigger than himself. Because sometimes the most unlikely heroes are forged in the fires of a fight they didn't even know they were meant for.